not an architect, when they were publishing the Aga Khan Awards, they had the image of Aladdin Mustafa. So it was quite remarkable. It was very touching, and for me also, I used that to discuss projects of this nature. So how do you celebrate an architectural project? Think about that. Okay, so that's, so it was all beautiful and wonderful. Makes me think also. So I hope you will work on your next little write-up. Because as you do and as we discuss, it all helps us think a little bit more about what we already know. Okay, little pause. We go on to the topic of the day. Designing in the public realm. There's a lot to say about the public realm. We will toy back and forth how to call it or describe it. What title should we use for this week's discussion? At one point we said public space. That seemed too straightforward. We don't want to use straightforward things. So we thought that maybe public realm would be the best way to think about this, because by discussing this under the umbrella of public realm, we can actually get into a lot of ways of how we inhabit, how we use, how we occupy, how we participate in or not participate in what we call public or civic spaces. Very important. One way we announced it was from the Assembly Building, Khan's Assembly Building to Baitul Road, which is what you have on the screen. Marina Tabasum is not here. She would not have liked that linkage. She felt that's too much. She would say that. But I think there's a possibility of a discussion. And I'm not going to discuss this too much, the relationship. I'll leave it to the very end. Why have I these two projects up here? They are of very different scale, obviously, both physically, programmatically, and in terms of their reception and impact. But nonetheless, and I would say that Marina's work, the mosque, is a very sort of interesting, carries on the lineage of Khan's thinking about volumetric relationship, volumetric relationship, parts and whole, the quality of light, movement in and around the building and towards the building. All those things are very much true for both the projects, even there are different scales. But one element that's common to both is, and it applies to both Khan, and he was bold enough about this, and I've discussed this elsewhere. Unlike any other modernist architect, he was not afraid of tackling what you might call the spiritual in architecture. In the 50s and 60s, nobody was discussing spirituality. Definitely not religiosity. And there's a difference. What is the spiritual and what is the religious? And maybe I'll have a chance to discuss that later. But maybe quickly, if you look at the Assembly Building, there are two places of meeting or congregation. One is the Assembly Hall itself, the chamber, and the other is the mosque, which is really a prayer hall, and you know the plan. So I describe the assembly as a place of spirituality and the prayer hall as a place of religiosity. Okay. And in Marina's case, I think the two merge, the spiritual and the religious. The mosque is fundamentally a religious space. Whether it can be a spiritual place, that is a big debate. Okay? So we'll talk about that in a second. But the thing is that the two projects are up here just to show you what we might be discussing. How do I know? She's like hot and wet. Okay. So design in the public realm. Well, there is the public realm, which I'm going to discuss in a second, but I'm also inserting the action of design. So there is a question of designing. By designing, I simply mean arranging and rearranging what is there. Okay? So that is designing. And this can be done by varieties of people, which I've discussed before. It need not be done by architects. The public realm is very much sort of a urban condition. I mean, by urban, I don't mean like big cities, smaller cities, or settlements, which means that the public realm involves a large group of people who are sharing or not sharing. And that is the question we must bring up, that they must be sharing, but sometimes they're not sharing because the cities and settlements are often places of inequality, that everybody doesn't have equal, uninterrupted access to spaces that they should have access, which is the public realm, right? And it oftentimes depends on design, oftentimes depends on policy, oftentimes depends on cultural practice. And all of these things needs a little tackling. I don't know if anybody has seen this map. Anybody? This is a map by an Italian artist. The date is right there. Very well known. Anybody studying cities has to know this map. Giambattista Noli. It's called the Noli map. This is a part of the map. It's actually, I think I may have a full image of Rome drawn by Noli. But what you see here, so I'll say frankly, this is what I'm talking about, or I'll be talking about sort of various range and scale and conditions, but fundamentally this is what I'm talking about. But tell me, anybody can tell me that what you see in the map. You see something. I think all of you are architects, or most of us are architects. We can read plans. This is the map of a city. What do you see?
Open space.
Open space. This is the pointer to correct.
Move it a bit.
Open space. So these are open spaces, streets, little plazas. That's Piazza Navona. That's a plaza in front of a building. This is a garden. So open spaces, right? But do you see buildings and plans? Yes. You see a church. You can see the Pantheon. And you can see this is a courtyard. And you can see other buildings. And I don't know all of them. This is a church. A building with a courtyard. That's a church. So it's a network of, yes, spaces. Did you say open spaces? They need not be all open because it's a building, they have a roof. But it's a network of public spaces. By that I mean spaces that you can walk through, enter, more or less uninterrupted. Maybe the church door is closed in the evening, but when the door is open, you have a right to go in. Nobody will say, don't come in, you cannot come in. That's the public realm. On the street, you can walk around. Unless it's a space of inequality, okay? And there are many societies where one community cannot go to another space, or because of economic class, we stop one group of people entering another space. That is certain gated communities and so on and so forth. But now this is an ideal situation. So this is a map of Rome showing the network of public spaces. And by that simply I mean spaces that a citizen of the city or anybody visiting the city can walk around in an uninterrupted way and have rights and access to those spaces, unless it's closed for some reason. Okay. And that's the public realm, where you become the public, you're part of the public. and as you can see, all the dark areas, they are residential or closed off. They are controlled. They are not part of the public realm. And I don't know, in most cases they are residential, so they are private. So already we have a difference between an understanding of the public as not private. So it's a dualistic situation. And so the meaning of the public becomes more meaningful when you pose it against what it is not, which is the private. I'll come back to that. Let's see this first. There are two words, public and civic, and you can use them alternately. Civic comes from the word civitas, from where we get civilization, the word, and also city, where we can be together. So there is a question, already a question of the collective. The public realm is also a condition of the collective. One person cannot be public. One person cannot be civic. At least it takes two. And by being two, there is a mode of relationship. You have to be of a certain behavior. You can't jump around. You cannot go and attack the person. I mean, if you do, then you're being uncivic, uncivilized. So you already maintain certain rituals, code of conduct, whereby you participate in the civil behavior of that place. Civil behavior may change from one city to another, one place to another. In some cities, you can go around with a certain dress, which would not be fine in another city because it's part of the civic code, and you have to maintain that. So the public and the civic are alternate terms. But what I am focused, or what I would like to show you or point out to you is this opposition. Another way to understand the public or the civic, as I said, you need to pose the opposite, which is the private. And one way to talk about it is the difference between home and the world. Okay, the home is not the public. Anything outside the home is the public, to put it simply. Now, this has become complicated. Okay, the public has now invaded the home. You know, through all these devices, television, and all kinds of things. So it has become blurred. And historically, in pre-modern times, it was much more clear what is the public domain, what is the private domain. In Roman Latin term, the Romans loved duality, opposition, doitoka. And each culture kind of produces this opposition to clarify things for themselves. And they learned it from the Greeks. In the Pantheon, in the Parthenon, you know, the temple Parthenon, they had sculptures of gods and goddesses. And those sculptures were paired up, like a pair of gods or goddess or goddesses. And those, well, of course, as you know, that all the sculpture is now in the British Museum. And Greece and England is constantly debating, you know, we need those back. But that's a different point. One pair of gods and goddess is Hermes and Hestia. So Hermes is a male god and Hestia is a female goddess. And they're paired up. And then there are other goddesses, you know, some of them you know very well. But it's interesting, why would they pair up Hermes and Hestia? Hermes is the goddess of speed and messenger, Nike. The Latin name is Nike, right? We have the sneakers that comes from there. But Hermes is not the Hermes bag. You know, maybe bag is a messenger also, carry there. Well, so Hermes is the god of movement. And Hestia, very ancient goddess in Greek culture, is the goddess of the fireplace and the hearth, the sacred hearth of the house. That's sacred. And Hestia is to maintain the fire of the sacred hearth. She would be unmarried. Being married means to go off from the household. So she's an unmarried goddess who fire of the household, and by that the household is maintained. The well-being, the permanence of the household is maintained. So there are two goddesses. One is sort of immobile, no movement, the other is movement. And they paired the two gods and goddesses. So I'm just giving you that as an example. And the Romans picked up this theme, and to understand their public life, they described these two range of lives, private and public, as domi and fori. As you can see on there. The word domi, from there we get domestication. And because the Indo-European language, the Latin language, is related to Sanskrit, domi, domestic, is the same as dampatto, the marital life, dampatto. Originally, dampoti is the sort of the lord of the house. Today we don't believe that the man is the lord of the house. But the word is the basic idea is dhamma in Sanskrit, and in Roman is domi, and from where you get domus, the magazine. So domi, domus, domesticate is the home, which has to be maintained through sacred fire, both in Latin culture and Vedic culture and Sanskrit culture. But fori it literally means outside, which is not part of the home. From fori we get the English word foreign. It's elsewhere, something else. So this sort of play of notions, concepts, words, kind of interesting. And from fori, the Roman public life, architecturally, the Roman urban life was defined by, this is a map of a part of Rome, the Roman forums. If you have taken architecture history, you must have come across Trajan's Forum, Hadrian's Forum. There are basically enclosed spaces like this with an arcade, open to sky courtyard, and around the arcade would be the judgment area, a little market, a meeting place. It's a place for meeting and gathering. But please, yes, in Rome, as in Athens, not everybody could be in the public place, as you know. Women were not. Non-Greeks were not in Greece. And in Rome also, they were like, again, this is civil code of the place. But these are the forums. And the word forum comes from fori. You go out of the home and you go to the forum. You become public. So, to understand again the sort of relationship of private and public, historically, sociologically, is important. I have a few other images here. This is a view, a reconstructed view of Athens with this set of buildings and the Parthenon up on the Capitol in hills. Again, two set of important buildings in the city. That is originally called the Capital, and that's why we often describe Shamshabhavan as capital complex and a capital city and all this. Capital means head, kaput, capital, head, the head of the city. In Athens, it was set up on a mountain, on a hill, so therefore it is on the top, so it is like a head, but not necessarily always it has to be on a hill. Even if it is flat, it's the head of the city. Like in Chandigarh, the capital complex is the head of the city according to the layout, but it doesn't have to be up on a hill. So there is a place which is the head of the city, which holds the most important buildings of the city. In Athens, it's a group of temples, especially with the Parthenon. But then there's another group of buildings here, which is called the Agora. Do you know the word Agora? Some of you do. Tell me, please, what is an Agora? Market? And that's it. Outside. No, Agora is basically a marketplace, but it may have other smaller temples. And it may have other smaller buildings where local judgment and all that can happen. But it's again a place where you gather and do public things, collective things. But primarily it's a set of markets, stalls, open space, and spaces for doing legal transactions, and small temples, because if you want to sell a cow, there's a temple for cows, a temple for clothes, all that sort of thing. But yes, it's Agora is the daily, ordinary life of the city, and the capital up there is the special life of the city, and the two are related. One particular time, and I'm just mentioning this, because this is the specific nature of public places can be very also informal and can also be organized. And so this one is organized, but in a kind of, as you can, this is kind of Greek planning in a random way, but this is organized in a much more formal way. But the two are related. In one particular time of the year, a procession would go through the market. This is the road. It's called the Pan-Hellenic Road. And they would go up in a procession and march up the hills and then go to the Parthenon. So what you see as buildings is not the full story. To make the buildings come alive, you must participate in public rituals. So rituals, processions, as we have in Dhaka, Poila Boishak, perhaps Boimela, you participate in the rituals of the city. And in many places, like in Bhaktapur in Nepal, you have religious processions happening in a particular time of the year that circles the town. And has anybody been to Bhaktapur? Bhaktapur is a kind of, in layout, is an irregular city. But there are different temples. And on those particular processional days, people move around from temple to temple and reconstruct a mandala. The city in plan is not like a mandala. As you know, the mandala is a very strong, gridded, geometric plan. In plan, the city does not look like that. But people reconstruct a mandala through ritual procession. So my point is that the public life, this is part of the public life. It can be regular, day-to-day, informal, but it can also be very formal. And that formality gives a new meaning to the life of the city. And you have to participate in that. And if you come as a visitor, that's one thing. But if you're part of the system, and if you also believe in it, you can reconstruct an invisible city. That's not visible. That's important. And I'm showing this. This is the Diwani Am. In many Mughal courts, there were buildings which were part of the palace complex, and you have seen most of them, I'm sure. There's the Diwani Khas, which is for the emperor and his close comrade. But in the Diwani Am, for the people could go and complain to the emperor. So I guess anybody could go there. So this is about accessibility. So there are different range of public spaces from what you see here. Just a quick example. So I'm going to be talking about this. I'm trying to understand public realm. বাংলাতে কি হবে আমি এখনো সঠিকভাবে জানি না একটা শব্দ চালু আছে গণপরিসর which sounds too invented. So which is a big question, that public realm, the description and definition of public realm in our part of the world, in Bangladesh, and I don't mean you don't have to cut across the whole subcontinent. Each part defines the public realm in different ways. I just mentioned Bhaktapur. This needs to be understood, that there are different ways of defining and inhabiting the public realm. And if we don't have a proper word for it, then something must be going on, and I'll let you answer that, because we don't have a proper word. In Latin, you have the forum, and then piazza, plaza, and so on, a courtyard, and in a second I'll mention what is a commons.
English.
Yes. The bazaar, of course, bazaar is a public part of the public realm, of a particular kind, of a marketing kind. Right, sure. But that's of a very commercial nature. Right?
That's the primary, but then again people go out and it's totally true.
And that's why I'll be going back to Assembly Building and Baituru Road to discuss, the range of public realms. And obviously, yes, the Haat and the Bazaar is the sort of the most immediate part of the public realm. But I mean, I will tell you, like, if a word that conveys the public realm doesn't translate as Bazaar. Right? Bazaar is one kind of public realm.
So it's beginning as
Right.
recent past, and
Right.
Shahaba was
Right.
becoming a public realm.
Civic, Puro, right? Puro Sthan. Why not? So I think we need to invent. I think this is important because, and you may critique me for that, because I don't think we have been able to evolve a very strong culture of the public realm. And there's no shame in it, we haven't. We need to historically analyze this. This could be a huge PhD thesis, why we have not. In this context, I would like to mention the name of one person. and this discussion of the lack of public realm, the rise of public realm, or the loss of public realm, this discussion happens in all places, even in the United States. That's what I was going to point out. Richard Sennett, Sennett. He's a sociologist. He has been working with architects also, but he has written a number of books. One of his very well-known books is The Fall of Public Man. There are other books, Uses of Disorder, and you can look up Richard Sennett. Richard Sennett, Sennett. Very well-known figure. He has been looking at the history of the public realm in Western culture from the 19th century onwards. And he has a number of theories, and why is he saying that in the US or Europe, US particularly, there has been, in modern times, the loss of the public realm and therefore the fall of public man. He distinguishes that there has become too much individuality, that's one thing. To be public, you have to be collective. To be public, you have to share certain order. But if on the other hand, you have it, as we all might have, and he argues, it's a complex argument that has come out of capitalist economic order, competition, publicity, you don't want to share too much, it's all competition, it's all mine, monopoly. Because of all those things, the extreme individuality, and he also criticizes counterculture, like say hippie movement and all that from the 60s. That's not a mark of the public space. It's like individual artist, my work, or individual competition, my profit. All that sort of thing has led to the loss and lack of public spaces from being what they were. And he has been criticized by other people saying that he's too nostalgic for the 19th century public space, where people would go and give their hat to each other and all this sort of ritual thing, but that's one argument. But I think it's an important point, that why public life is fading. He hasn't written anything recently, but he would say it can go two ways. The loss of public life is also because of this, but this is another way of participating in the public realm, so it can go both ways. So, there are a few things Richard Sennett mentions that typically when we talk about the public realm, it's an urban experience. And it involves the urban experience and the interconnection, and I'm not going to describe all this, I'm just saying it as a quick notation. It's an interconnection. So public realm is an urban experience which is an interconnection between authority, modernism, and public life. So there's got to be an authority. It can't be everybody doing their own stuff, you know. And it's about participating in the modern life and also participating in the public life. You know, all that makes the new experience, which is the public realm. Sennett talks about a disciplined form of public life. You know, and this is not like police discipline, but I would say participating in rituals and codes and civil behavior. We don't even have civil behavior on the road, as you know, and that's why we have what we have. You know, the traffic condition in Dhaka, I can't say what percentage, but a big percentage is because we are uncivil on the road. If we maintain certain code and civic behavior, things would have gotten a little easier. And he talks about the public domain where people should have, he argues, people should have direct relationship to public spaces and buildings. You should not feel alien, you should not feel distance, but you can have a direct relationship. Like if you go to a plaza, you don't feel alienated. You go to the lobby of a building, or you go to a mosque, and that's why I'm coming back to the mosque. The mosque is a kind of part of the public realm, that you don't feel alienated. You know, there are spaces where you feel foreign. Should not happen. And the public realm involves citizenship. Nagorikota. Amra boli na nagorikotto. It is interesting because it comes from Nagorik, the city life, being part of the city, citizen. But citizen, we mean a member of the nation. Interesting twist here. But originally, citizen is a member of the city. I have rights to the city. That's a citizen. When you don't have rights, you're not a citizen. There are a lot of people from Bangladesh who work in the Middle East, in Dubai, Doha. They're actually building up the city, but they are not citizens. They do not have rights and access. So that's a divided city, a city of inequality. So I've always described this elsewhere. Dubai is a very perverse city because the public life there is distorted, divided, hierarchized, and most people who are not Dubaians, they don't have access and rights. So that's a negative description of it. It looks like a fantastic city. It looks like one, buildings and spaces and everything works. But living in the city, you don't have access. So looking good is not all good. Okay? It's how people behave, participate in the public realm. Richard Sennett, I'm mentioning him because the book Fall of Public Man is very important to understand this theme, public realm. He also differentiates, and it's a complex argument, he also differentiates between socialist practices and capitalist practices. The capitalist practice is always about competence and competition. Whoever is in the upper strata of the competition, he or she gains more. But in a socialist, and I don't mean like a socialist government, but in a socialist relationship, it's about dependence and mutuality. Eke oporer proti tan ba সম্পর্ক রাখা. And that doesn't come out in competition or competence. Okay, so দুরকম condition. Joseph Rickwart, another urban scholar, also happens to be my professor and a good friend of Richard Sennett. He has written a lot. His very important book is The Idea of the Town, and he has argued a lot about ritual practices. Rituality যেটা বললাম সেটা দিয়ে activate করা শহর. The other thing Joseph Rickwart talks about is the practice of neighborliness. That's part of the public realm. Neighborliness. Extreme individuality, alienation, And living by yourself does not create the public realm. So one big aspect of the public realm is neighborliness.
What's the
And
book name? Like you said.
just a Greek word.
What's the book?
The idea of the town. That's a very important book, if you're interested. So the practice of neighborliness, and another term which is interesting, public intimacy. But you can't be in public, I don't mean intimacy in its immediate sense, but in public you feel at ease with yourself and with each other. Practice of neighborliness, I like that. So it's not about the practice of the family. We're devoted to the family, no doubt about it. And we're devoted to ourselves, but how much are we devoted to the neighbors, to the neighborhood? It starts from there. বাংলা চিন্তা করছিলাম নেইবারলিনেসের বাংলা কি হতে পারে প্রতিবেশিতা হতে পারে প্রতিবেশী ওকে আর পাবলিক অ্যান্ড প্রাইভেট তো বললামই আচ্ছা এখানে there are a few things that I wanted to point out which I will discuss as I go along. The public realm is enacted in public spaces. The public realm is a topic that can be discussed, of course, by sociologists like Richard Sennett, by anthropologists, architectural anthropologists by as Joseph Rickert, and economists. So public realm is a topic that can be discussed by people from various disciplines. But at the end of the day, I feel, as an urbanist, that it must happen in space. So public realm is an operation that takes place in public spaces, right? So which most of us will understand. As I was saying, if you read Richard Sennett, some of the discussions may seem a little foreign to you in first reading unless you have a background in economics and socialism and Marxism and capitalism. But as architects we have to understand those also. But we understand public space, how it is inhabited, used a bit more. So that's what perhaps I will focus, public space. And I have a list of names in English and other languages which are aspects of the public space. Some which are very familiar with. Commons, maybe not, I'm not quite sure. I'll talk about that in a second. Park, yes. Street, plaza, piazza, Maidan, I think you know, but there might be something more interesting in there. Coulier, have you come across that term? See, so we'll talk about that. And Waqf, which some of you have heard, right? Yes. That's could be seen. Not all of Waqf, elements of Waqf is of the public realm, but this is a practice in Islamic traditions of inheritance, not inheritance, of giving out, charitable giving out, which could be a way of organizing the public realm. So, we can think about. This could be an exercise. What are the terms, architectural and urban terms that are part of the public realm or define or describe the public realm? I mean, Waqf even বললাম, কারণ there are Arab scholars who have given a lot of attention, architectural, urban Arab scholars who have given a lot of attention to Waqf practices, which is now maybe not that predominant in Bangladesh or India, but in the Middle East and all that, for the last 500-600 years, that was a practice of establishing a madrasa, establishing a garden, establishing a hospital, that was a part of the practice, and legally creating public realm. Okay. ঘরে বাইরে ডোমিফোনির আরেকভাবে বলা যায় ঘরে বাইরে, এটা তো আমরা বুঝি। ঘরে বাইরে এই ছবিটা দেখাচ্ছিলাম, হ্যাঁ, চারুলতা। আর ঘরে বাইরে আরেকটা ছবি আছে না, হোম অ্যান্ড দ্য ওয়ার্ল্ড ইংরেজিতে। বাট এই ছবি আপনারা দেখেছেন এই ছবিটা সবাই? কে দেখেননি? This is a classic. It describes not just a human relationship, but it also describes a social, spatial, urban environment. Kolkata, and this is a beautiful shot. I don't know if you remember the last shot. Karo mone ache শেষের shotটা এখান থেকে শুরু হয় কিন্তু shotটা আমি খুঁজছিলাম এই ছবিটা পেলাম না এখানে চারু she and I mean their relationship is not that bad but it's not intimate and she relies on other people for cultivating her interests and desires Amol and his husband is a nice person but he's a man of the world he runs a printing press he's constantly reading he's a man of the public world তাই না আর ভদ্রলোকের নাম কিন্তু ইন্টারেস্টিং ভূপতি so in the last scene he is walking away down the corridor last shotটা হচ্ছে ভূপতি পিছনটা দেখা যাচ্ছে সিঁড়ি দিয়ে নিচে নেমে যাবে নিচে নেমে গিয়ে তার প্রেসের অফিস and the world বাইরে forum আর চারুলতার দাঁড়িয়ে দেখছে হাতে বাইনোকুলার ও কিন্তু বাইনোকুলার দিয়ে দেখে সারাক্ষণ জানলা দিয়ে দেখে সে সবসময় বাইরে যায় না so her relationship with the outside world is compromised or mediated by this instrument binocular so that's the big thing তো ভূপতি যখন যাচ্ছিল she picks up the binocular and looks at him through the binocular মানে it's about the distance between what she is the domestic person the domesticated person and Bhupati the outside the man of the world a man of the public realm so she's not participating in the public realm এই দূরত্ব এভাবে আমার বর্ণনা এটা আপনারা মানতে পারেন নাও মানতে পারেন আর ঘরে বাইরে তো forget the name of the lead female but she actually physically goes out and that brings disaster তো ওটা আবার ক্রিটিক করা যায় হ্যাঁ ঘরের বার হলে ডিজাস্টার হবে তো এইসব ব্যাপার আছে but I think these are fantastic reflections interpretations of the emerging urban life of the middle and upper middle class Bengali households no matter Hindu or Muslim and that defines what is domestic interior and what is exterior public Japan এক সময় Japan was not ruled by China but in Japan হয়তো 300 বছর আগে there was a clear difference between what constituted the domestic space and what was the outside space the domestic space was ruled by the women the language spoken was Japanese and then the outside was ruled by more Chinese culture and the language was more or less Chinese. The men dressed in either different ways. By the 19th century, of course, the men were dressed in as like this big difference. Western dress and the women wearing traditional dress. So big difference in what is interior and outside. And this private and public also corresponds to the language we use. আপনারা চিন্তা করে দেখেন বাড়িতে কি ভাষা ব্যবহার করেন আর বাইরে কি ভাষা ব্যবহার করেন বাড়িতে কিরকম পোশাক পরেন বাইরে কি ধরনের পোশাক পরেন বাড়িতে কিরকম চালচলন বাইরে কিরকম চালচলন we don't perhaps give this too much thought but we make these differentiations okay so this is the larger map of the Noli plan and I would request that all of you note down the name Noli plan. It's a plan of the public space, network of public space of the city. And once this plan was well known for all architects. Louis Kahn's, this was a favorite map of his, as well as others. The map is also made up of various signs and emblems. If you look very closely, you will find things like this. So things that are part of the public realm. I don't want to point all of them out, but obviously there are rivers, roads, cemetery, theater, of course piazza, drain, all those things. Those are not part of the home and the private. So in Noli's plan, those are all very carefully marked. And an index of them makes up the physical life of the public realm. And then there are other artists in other cities who made Noli plan of their city. This is a map of Paris, done much later. And then there are other people who have done Noli plan. So the Noli plan is, Noli plan bolle, we know what to expect. Simplifying the Noli plan, again this is Rome. The public realm is a network of streets, to put it very simply, network of streets and public buildings and public spaces. This is a close-up of St. Peter's. It shows very clearly at that time in the 18th century. And then you look at the photograph, nothing much has changed. I'm quickly showing what constitutes the public realm in Noli's view of Rome. I'm not looking at the architecture particularly. But then what are the other examples? That needs to be seen. You know, we can't all be using European examples. But if we say that, then we must analyze what is around us, near us. In Delhi or other North Indian cities, many of the public gardens are originally Mughal monuments, as you know. So they were not originally gardens. They were converted into gardens. But they were part of the larger royal enclosure, and not everybody had equal access, but access then happened. As for example, Akbar's tomb. It's not about the tomb building itself. The moment we say Akbar's tomb, we look at the buildings, but it's in a setting. It's a public setting. Now it has become a public setting. So that's one. And I'll say a few things about other examples. And the one on the right is the very well-known Maidan-e-Shah in Isfahan, which, and frankly I'm not quite sure, at the time in the 16th and 17th century, when it was highly used, when everybody had equal access to the Maidan-e-Shah, I'm not sure, because you know the palace was on the left, the Abbasi mosque, as you see on the closer to you, and then there's a network of streets, and on the farther side there's also a network of streets which are actually bazaars. Bazaars and little courts. I have a plan at some point. You go through the network of streets, and then you go through an alley and you come to a courtyard, and there are shops around the courtyard. So it's sort of very well organized set of network of spaces, from the informal, the irregular, the ungeometric to the very geometric and formal. But what I wanted to emphasize is what makes the public realm. I was asking you if you have heard the word coulier. Coulier, very simply, may mean a complex. This is Suleymania Masjid complex in Istanbul. It's a beautiful set of spaces. The moment we say Hagia Sophia or Suleymania or Selimiye, we think of that beautiful mosque. But it's not about just the mosque. It's about all these buildings. I don't remember exactly. Some of them are caravanserais. Some of them are actually shops around the courtyard. Some are libraries, some are orphanages. This is the tomb of Sinan. You have heard the name of Sinan, who designed all this mosque. So it's in a triangle. So he designed this corner where he wished to be put in a tomb. But then it's in a setting, and you see, look, why I have this image up? Because it's all green. And it is green. And then there is a cemetery. I'm not sure exactly. Let's see. These are some couliers from small to big of different kinds. As you can see, madrasa, maktab, hammam, which is a bathhouse. It's very interesting. So in Middle Eastern culture, bathhouse is a public space for men and women, not all households have bathing facilities, they would go to the bathhouse. Many cities used to have that. So that's a public space. Caravanserai. Turbesi is a graveyard or cemetery. So, but what you see as the green is actually many of those spaces are, I don't know what to call them. They're not gardens, but they're graveyards or cemeteries. We don't do that in our culture, but I've seen that in Turkey especially. People go on picnic to the graveyard. It's a nice garden, family would go, spread out a mat and have a picnic. I mean, they're not making like indie music sound and all that in picnic, but they're sitting, they're eating, and I was in Istanbul once during Ramadan, like hundreds of people in the cemeteries, kids running around. So it's like, that's a public space. Nobody could say, no, you should not enter here. Of course, there's a proper behavior at the same time, appropriate to that culture. But it's used as a public space. I don't think we can call our cemeteries, Qabristan, as public space. You can go there, walk around, nobody will stop you. But that's all about it. So I'm showing this a Kuliye. Its crown is the main mosque, but it has all these sort of ancillary buildings and spaces which are used for public practice, access. So think about that. Commons. Commons is a word which I believe came from England, but in early United States, spaces were designated as commons. And as the name shows or tells you, it belongs to the common. The commoner is to everyone. But commons is originally a collection of resources. It could be natural resources which belongs to everyone, and I don't mean only in cities. In many cultures you would have commons. It's about private ownership, and in many cultures there is not a notion of private ownership historically, non-European. And you could farm, you could use, you could cattle herd, those spaces. They would belong to the whole community. But it belongs to a certain members of a society, and they have declared, and it's recognized it's for the whole community. They could be natural resources, or they could be cultural resources. So they are held, the definition of commons is held in common, not privately. But it's also dictated by various social practices. You could not just go and start building something there, because it also belongs to me. Okay, you couldn't go and start digging things up. So you have to behave in a certain way, which that particular community and society allows. So this is the example of commons. And if you go to Boston, it has become a park, and as you can see, many things are happening here. It's about the design of the space, the nature of the space. It's about the things, the life that take place in that space. You can see a military parade, you can see families, and maybe some events going on in the farther distance. And these were called urban commons. This was an opportunity for citizens to have a sense of power or management over a space. And you could not be stopped, at that time. Even now, but now it's a park, anybody can go in. The moment it was declared as a commons, people could go and access the space. And the way a commons was carved out of a city space, it was carved out because of a certain common use. Very important. It was carved out because of a certain common use, not market value. The space could be extremely valuable, square inch wise, acreage wise, like Sorority Uddan. And যদি আমরা বাড়ি বানানো শুরু করি, plot করে divide করতে শুরু করি, because it has such market value. That would be, the Sorority Uddan is an example of commons. So it was decided that this is of a particular use of the citizenship and defined by those uses and not by market value. everybody agrees, and everybody then participates and uses that. So, commons is of that type. David Harvey, Harvey, he's a philosopher, geographer. He wants to make a distinction of what is an urban space and what is a commons, which is also important. So is all urban spaces commons, or does particular urban spaces become commons? He tells us that public spaces become commons when part of the citizens take political action. So it can become a space for political action. You can think of Shahbag Square. It's neither a square, not a courtyard, not a plaza, it's just a road intersection. And then by taking political action, it has become a commons. And we all agree that we will behave in a certain way there. But there are protocols and practices. In early United States, commons were just open grounds, trees and lawns and grasses. They were not like the European piazzas and plazas, which is also public spaces. And so, as you can see from the previous image and here, it's just a space for strolling around. Commons can happen now. Yeah, I mean, this is a parking lot in a shopping center somewhere in Berlin, which could be transformed into a commons. And different kinds of activities can happen here, as you can see, that happens in the commons. This is example right from home. It's not a square, it's not a piazza, it's not an intersection, but it can be converted to a commons. And Shahbag, the practice of Shahbag has happened in many cities where people, one way or another, have decided to take political action in public spaces. As in Tahrir Square, which was the first big event in 2011 where formalized urban spaces, in formalized urban spaces, like, if you can see the image, in regular time, I don't think you can just go and do whatever you want there. You cannot take political action. You take political action, you'll be arrested, right? But when that sort of gathering happens, you have taken political action. You have upturned the value of the urban space. So that's the difference between urban space and converting to a commons, according to Harvey. But as we know that then this becomes political action in public spaces has implications and violence can happen, as has happened. So which is what we're going to see here from Kiev. And that public square in Kiev is called a Maidan. And this is a term I want you to think of also. Let's see that. This is a trailer of a documentary on the public space called the Maidan, which becomes a commons. It's a trailer.
Шановна громада, це задивився на вас. І нашу громадську частину, як належить, треба почати з державного гімну, правда?
Maidan is a term which in our region we use. ময়দান তো একটা জায়গা হতে পারে যেখানে খেলাধুলা হয়, যেটা আমরা বলি আলোয়ানি ময়দান. But that's one aspect of Maidan. The most formal aspect of Maidan is what you saw from Isfahan. That big long rectangular space is called Maidan-e-Shah. It's a Persian word. Which was adopted by the English in colonial times, and Maidan became a big large open space for military parade, which is what used to happen in the Maidan in Calcutta. So there are different uses of Maidan. But basically you can say it's an open public space which does not have much of a definition. You can call it a park, but not necessarily all Maidans are park, but it's kind of a public space. Which shifts its significance and meaning from its original roots in Iran as it comes to North India and then Bengal. But that's the closest we can come with a type of public space, Maidan. A friend of ours, Anuradha Mathur, she has written a very interesting essay on the Maidan as a kind of landscape space, which can shift from one function to another. When Gandhi was marching against the English in Ahmedabad, protesting, procession, the English forbid him to assemble in public spaces. So there are defined public spaces. Amader ekhon ache na je you have to take police permission to assemble, right? And sarakon lati beta kore, darale lati beta kore, because you have to have permission. So that's part of the ritual. Okay, so Gandhi was like, have you been to Ahmedabad, anybody? Okay, and you know the river, or almost a river, which has now become a lake, for the urban design, but the Sabarmati River, which becomes very dry in summer times. Very dry, no water, just a dudu mud. So Gandhi was declined permission to assemble, and he was forbidden. So, okay, Gandhi said, I'll go to the river. There was no water, and he assembled there in the river, because it's not defined as a public space, it's a river, I'm meeting in a river. So that was one, like Gandhi, very clever, so he used terminologies, and I think he was allowed to assemble. So that became a Maidan. By that practice, you can say commons, Maidan, in whatever way, by political action, it becomes a new kind of public space. And of course, I don't want to say too much about this from the European examples, piazzas and plazas. And again, different things happen here. I believe once a year, there's a horse racing that happens here. First of all, people just gather here, you can see coffee houses and restaurants sitting on the outside, you can walk around, anybody could walk around, but then there are ritual things where other kinds of activities happen. There's a beautiful drawing by Louis Kahn of the same space. And you can, I don't want to analyze this, maybe you want to do that, why he uses this particular colors, showing public spaces, for shadows and colors. So public spaces can become from one thing to the other. This is again the Piazza Navona. Not anymore, but at certain times of the year, they could do a little embankment and flood the piazza. And they would do boat-based demonstration and display. And of course, the Pompidou Center and the plaza here, as if the horizontal plaza becomes vertical, because as people move up and down, that becomes a set of activities. It's very difficult to figure out what's the exterior and the interior. There's a blurring of the public and the private that can happen too. I'll say a little bit about parks. Now we take for granted cities must have parks. There are a lot of designs of parks that's happening in Dhaka. But something you might want to think about, park, what is it? Where did it come from? It's an imported idea in our part of the world. We say Sarvarti Uddan. Uddan and Aram, those are two words used in ancient times, in Buddha's times. Aram is a garden, it's a pleasure garden belonging to the king. Udyan is also a garden. Garden is a cultivated place. You know, it's not a forest. Forest is uncultivated. A garden is a cultivated place. So it needs care, it needs resource, it needs investment. So not everybody could do that. And typically kings and noblemen and all those people or rich people would have gardens. So also in Europe, before parks became public spaces, they were very restricted spaces. In Versailles, you have these huge forest-like gardens. They were called parks. So the parks were created in England and in France by the royalty for hunting purposes. It's a very controlled environment. You have animals which are reared in the big forest, and so the kings would go out and hunt. It was not for the commons. It is called the park. And then gradually democratization and so on and so forth, the parks were given off to the public and it became a public space. So don't think parks were always public spaces. There's a history behind all of these terms that I've just mentioned. And of course the coulier I mentioned, these are gardens also. So there are specific design of these spaces, which is, a courtyard within the mosque, which is also a public space. Anybody could go in there, as you know, and that's why I put up these two projects. Mosque is a religious space, but it's also a community space. Again, yes, perhaps not for women all the time, but historically mosques were places, men of the faith, and perhaps in some places men of not of the faith also would be allowed to come. They could rest. They could even spend the night. People did that. It's like a caravanserai. They would even bring their camels and all that, tie that in the courtyard, and then leave in the morning. Sometimes local arbitration would take place in mosques. I think it happens even now in rural areas and all that. So the mosque is a very diverse set of space, and not only for the purpose of prayers. But of course then, I've seen in Turkish mosque complex the most organized. It's a cultural complex, as I mentioned earlier. But then there are gardens and cemeteries where people could go and wander around. But then this happens. So this is the big cutoff point, the modern city, where public space gets redefined, and oftentimes in not so good ways, because most people, and I don't mean the big modernist architects, perhaps even they did that, but I think the second generation modern architects focused more on the structures, the buildings, and not so much on the areas around them, which then became occupied by motor cars. And that's what Sennett also means, as well as Jane Jacobs, the loss of public space. And that was one of the biggest criticism of modern architecture, or modern urban architecture, or modern urban space, the loss of public space. This is a sketch by Leon Creer, and this perhaps may be happening in Dhaka also. Each plot is given to one architect, and they're doing all stunning buildings. One does not relate to the other. The intermediate spaces between the buildings have no articulation and no significance, so no meaningful use. Basically, they're objects in an open space, not defining what is a public space, what is a community space, what is a civic space. So that was one of the big criticisms of Leon Creer, which is I see happening in Dhaka also. All architects doing stunning buildings in their own little courtyard, and there is no definition of what can be commons, what can be shared spaces, nothing like that. But this was Leon Creer in the 90s, late 70s or early 80s, I think. And that's why he has a splash mark. This is not the city that he wants. He wants a city that is defined by these very fragile creatures, the human being, 5 foot 6, 7, 8 inch high. And let's not forget that after all what I have said, ultimately the public space belongs to these people, the pedestrian. It's not very difficult. It doesn't have to be an economic argument, it doesn't have to be a sociological argument, it's just as basic as that. The public space is inhabited by these creatures who are vulnerable, who are fragile, and who walk. Okay, and that creates public spaces. It's not complicated as far as I'm concerned. And so since the 80s, there was a whole big movement about the pedestrian, the human space, the humanized space, which was lost in the modern city, and how to recover that. And there are many architects who worked on those. I just showed this, the difference between object making and space making, two different attitudes about being an architect. The street and the plaza. It may seem simple, which is how traditional European cities were conceived and used, and not much complicated. Streets of various nature and spaces of various nature. You can see some spaces doing that. And then some architects in the late 70s and 80s, like Rob Creer, who was brother to Leon Creer, did this investigation and documenting and mapping of all kinds of urban spaces in Europe that you could find, from small to big, from formal to informal, from regular to irregular, and he made an archive of public spaces, or urban spaces, which was put together as a book, Urban Space. And for some of us, graduating from architecture in the late 80s, this was kind of a little Bible, because still a photography, right? Because we took this position, okay, not so much of that, no, but that, okay? Space, connections of spaces. And as I said, two different attitudes. And we were interested in this. And, we are motivated by this. So, but this came about a revision of the nature of urban, civic, public space. And so we have to be grateful to some of these people. And someone like William White, I don't know if you know the name. He wrote a book and did a film. I think we can find it in YouTube. It's a classic film. Very, very dated now. It's called The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces. If you go in Wikipedia, which is interesting how William White is described, urbanist, journalist, analyst, and people watcher. And the film is about that. The film is about a certain section of Manhattan. He just has the camera there, just observing what people are doing, standing, walking, sitting, eating, talking. So we forget that when we do public spaces. And so that's a mapping of people gathering outside Saks Fifth Avenue, just how they cluster. Okay, there's a certain behavior of people in public spaces. Okay, so if you ask me, okay, what are the most important books through which I can understand public realm and public spaces, from sociology to architecture and city? And there are maybe a few other books. I may suggest this 5. Richard Sennett, Building and Dwelling, but also Richard Sennett's The Fall of Public Man. William White's The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces, not Maidanisha. André Lefebvre is a very famous sociologist, writer. The Production of Space. When space is produced, space is not what you can just find. And as you make buildings, you also make spaces. And of course, Rob Creer's Urban Space, and Edmund Bacon's Design of Cities, and beautiful drawings, of networks of spaces. So there could be a few other books, but if you're interested, you can try to get these books. The other person in terms of public spaces, understanding public spaces, is the British writer, artist, trained as an architect, Gordon Cullen, and another favorite of ours. His book, he used to draw for the Architectural Review. Every issue would have 2-4 pages by Gordon Cullen in this style, in the 60s onwards, I think. And they were collected together in a book called The Townscape. But what he did was, public realm has a texture also. It's not abstract. Of course, there's people, but there's also a texture. There's light, shadow, actual material, and this is navigating through the spaces of a town or a region, and they need to be documented. Distance, far, close, intimate, material, texture, because it's not an abstraction. If you say space, it doesn't mean anything. Space is already an actualizable space, an inhabitable space, must have material property, right? No matter what it is, must have dimension, must have volume, must have distance. And think of Khan's drawing, that's giving a texture to the public space. So which is what Gordon Cullen did. The public realm is a network, it's obvious, a public space can't be just an island, streets connect different spaces, small to big, so it's already a network. Because the street is the most fundamental public space and that connects everything. A street is a connector. And so quickly, various images of how European urbanists and artists have described their city as a network of spaces. And I love these images which I collect because we don't have this practice. From Noli to, I don't know the name of these artists, some are anonymous, but from Noli to Piranesi to all these artists, they're not interested in individual buildings, they see their city as a network of spaces. As this. Now this is Isfahan. What I was saying earlier, that's a mosque. The big courtyards are mosques, but then you can see covered streets. And these are all courtyards and shops, That could be a mausoleum. So again, a beautiful network of various kinds of buildings. Network of streets can be like this. It doesn't matter what the geometry is. But again, this is Noli-like. You can see what are the religious buildings that have crosses, and then alleys and streets. Streets, fundamental public space. Okay. So one thing may be obvious is that public spaces have a social life. Obvious. Right? I think in our case also it's very obvious, from small town, Mofashil Shahar, to bigger cities, whether by definition or by habits, certain spaces become public spaces. Bortola can be a public space. Intersection of two streets can become a public space. And of course there are gardens, and then circuit houses, Shamne Jagara can be a public space. But I think what we haven't done yet, some people may have, that we haven't documented what kind of social life happens there, which is very important. And only by knowing that you can actually design public spaces in Bangladesh, because otherwise you will be designing, or we will be designing, abstract public spaces. And by social life, you mean that it's also about not relating, but encountering. You encounter various kinds of people. And sometimes it may not be very pleasurable. It can be annoying or can be very problematic. But that's what public spaces are about, encounters, negotiations, navigation. Interestingly, new kinds of public spaces are being created or have been created, and I call them like semi-public realm, like the coffee house, which is a private space but opened up to the public. So, and I call it a micro-public realm. So we have a discussion day after tomorrow, and I expect Salahuddin Ahmed to have a little discussion about this, how we see. I mean, he's the first, you all know that he started coffee house culture in Dhaka. And that is a micro-public realm. Also, you must behave in a certain way. You can walk in there, and Salahuddin can tell you that how long can a person walk in there, sit and not order. But that's a different thing. But then it's compressed public space. interiorized. Some of those images are from other sources, so I don't explain that. That's a New Yorker cartoon, which is interesting. When it is waiting, go under a canopy. By accident, you're with other people. Whether you encounter or not, it's a miniature public space, right? And you have to behave in a certain way. The airplane is also like that. It's a miniature public space. Like you're stuck in there, and there's a code of ethics and all that you have to participate in. Okay. So, has anybody seen this film, Cinema Paradiso? Yes? No? It's only 2-3 people? 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, So, again, to know the life of a city, a place, that's a beautiful film. Not to mention it won the Oscar in 1988. So it shows this building, which is a church of the town. You know, in Italian setting, you have a public square and there's a church, the facade. From what I remember. But the church is out of money and it wants to raise money. So at other times it becomes a cinema hall. So, you know, the church is the best setting for that. You know, you have aisles and seats. So at one time it's a church, and so it goes back to what I was saying earlier, religious and secular in the same space. So and the film shows it in a humorous way, really good humorous way, very light, warm humor, that, you know, the people are in the church very sober and all that. And then they come in the evening, they're all very sort of Italian style, shouting, and they see a scene, you know, very sort of, you know, very not X-rated or something. They're all very interested. So it's a very lively scenario. So what happens is that, and there's this boy who is just wonderful in the film. You know, it's a little boy who befriends very grudgingly the man who runs the film, you know, the projectionist. There was an old man. They have a grudging relationship. This little boy comes, he loves films, and they have a beautiful relationship. So at one point, I think for whatever reason, the city won't allow any screening within the church. This one evening. So all the townspeople come in the evening, all like dressed up, and there's no screening. Okay, and there's a disappointment. So this scene, little clip, is about, I don't want to explain anymore, just see the conversion of a public space. So they're very angry. That's the boy and the projectionist.
Una folla non pensa, non sa quello che fa. Questo lo diceva il grande spicciacciase in furia. Allora, che dici? Ce lo facciamo vedere il film a queste povere pazze?
Magari, ma come si può fare?
Vedo che voi non volete credere alle mie parole, ma ai nostri occhi dovrete credere. E ora alza le chiappe alla perdannato sgabello. Attento. Abracadabra. Guarda la noce parte.
space. He's saying loss of revenue. Notes. So he looked at a part of the ticket che never do. So if you don't have this.
Basta pezzo. Sì, come uno lo sia, sì.
Signori miei, il biglietto dovete pagare. Ne do.
Vaffanculo, la piazza di dopo!
No! La piazza è mia! Picciotti, non scherziamo, se no mi cazzo!
So Sujuk Pileta, लेकिन तो पढ़ा ना, it's a beautiful film, you know, for various reasons. এটা আরেকটা জিনিস দেখাচ্ছিলাম যে how public, মানে ওই interchange of public space from a very formal piazza, fountain and everything, it becomes another kind of space. And that's not a commons really, it's a different kind of use of space. And then there are other kinds of practices, Melak and Malaysia, where this is a regular vehicular road which can get converted on weekends into a space like this, shops and eateries on the road. And then all kind of things can happen in public spaces. So this is the kind of thing that William White was documenting. And in public spaces, you watch people, you watch each other, that's the practice, is sit and watch. So that's something. And that concentration of people is needed. Typically, you don't do that, and I may be mistaken, in villages. Villages, everybody knows each other, and if you're staring at someone, that's a bad thing. But in cities, there's a practice of looking, staring. Anybody know this? Yes? In Tokyo, there is a particular area called Harajuku. That's the name of the neighborhood. And there's a particular street where young girls, high school girls, dress up in all kind of ways, in science fiction style, anime, manga, and whatever, Western pop. And they dress and go there and they just march up and down. Nowadays they take selfie and all that. And those girls are called Harajuku girls. And that's the name. If you go now, you will see them, in the evening. And somebody was writing about it, that it started right after the Second World War, because a lot of American soldiers were staying nearby, and they were like, that was the site of foreign things in Tokyo right after the war. And young men and women would go and imitate styles, clothing and all that. That's how it started. But now it has taken a style of its own. In Seoul, Korea, there's a street, and I'm sure you will know the name, Gangnam. It's the same thing. It's called Gangnam Style. You know that song, Gangnam Style? It's about that. That you go and dress in a certain way and parade up and down and be noticed. So that's Harajuku girls. And do you know this? Gwen Stefani? Some of you may know. So she actually did a production with the Harajuku girl style. So it has now become a little global also. So that can happen. Materials, furniture, public features like water, all kind of things can happen. Textures. This is one interesting example. This is the Campidoglio in Rome, which was designed by Michelangelo. Originally, this is from the book by Edward Bacon. Beautiful drawings. One-point perspective from the top. So originally it was like this. You can say it was an undefined public space. In Dhaka, there's a lot of that. You walk around and it's a public space. But then Michelangelo designed this and made this a beautiful, formal, highly sophisticated geometry of compression and opening out, and now you can experience it as a formal public space. In Manhattan, you can take, again, you find a lot of spaces like this in Dhaka city. They can be converted into spaces like that. Without not disturbing the traffic or parking, you can find other ways of doing that. By doing this, you give a new gift to the city, a new richness, you activate the public life, elevate the public life, which, because we're not, as I said, we have not defined the public realm in Dhaka city, because perhaps we don't have a word for it. If we had a word for it, and not everything is a Maidan, there needs to be a definition of public spaces. And then in New York, in Manhattan, in the last 10, 15 years, there has been a practice of reducing converting vehicular roads to pedestrian uses, public spaces. And we were just discussing this today in the office with Rochana and others, that it doesn't take much. You just demarcate and put some furniture. There's no fantastic design or anything, it's just that decision. And you can see that this little chairs and tables. And of course, you can create situations like this also. It's a vehicular road now permanently converted into a public space. And this has really changed and really added to the life of New York City. So it doesn't take much. And of course, highlight. I don't say too much about it, that there are undefined opportunities, spaces which are not urban spaces. This is an leftover infrastructural space, elevated rail line, which is then converted into the most beautiful public space. And then a few examples from the recent Aga Khan Award, what Suha was talking about, the bridge in Iran and the big plaza by the archangels. I think I'll pass this, I will not discuss this today, perhaps I'll have an opportunity of how Robert Venturi, who just passed away, so perhaps in honor of him with these images, his very well-known book, Learning from Las Vegas, was not interested in the architecture. No, that's not true. He was in Las Vegas. If you have seen some images of Las Vegas and if you've been there, I have flown through Las Vegas, been to the airport. I said, no, I'm not interested. Because already in the airport there's slot machines and all that. This is not my kind of a city because it's all about gambling and all that, and the buildings are all very loud, super designed, exaggerated, Greek, Egyptian. It's not my thing, but that's my problem. And though she was visiting us in Philadelphia, and he said, let's go to Las Vegas. I said, I'm not going. Oh, you are going. We all go together. But we didn't go. But Robert Venturi, when he was teaching in Princeton University in the late 60s or 70s, he took his students and did a studio on Las Vegas. And this came out as a book, the things that they found, without a prejudgment of the place, whether it's good or bad aesthetically, no, but how the public spaces are used, the streets, the building facades, the building fronts, and all kinds of other things that he discovered. So this could be a long story, but I will just go quickly. He documented signs. Signs are part of the public realm. In America, it's definitely so. It's all about driving. It's all about the automobile, which rules the public realm, but also you are part of the public realm in a car. And Las Vegas is all about entertainment and all this sort of. So it's all about signage. And Robert Venturi noticed that in the strip mall, as it is called, the signs are always like this. In Dhaka, most signs are, this is the building, the signs are here. In the roadway, the signs are here. You can turn your head and read the signs. But then the signs are in architecture. His students at that time, because it's all about car, Las Vegas is a lot of gas stations, petrol stations. So they documented petrol, they documented all these petrol stations. And they documented all the gambling establishment, sections, plans. And they documented how people collect. Las Vegas is also well known for gunshot weddings. So there's a lot of wedding chapels. Because you go with as a couple, you get maybe drunk or something, you get married. You lose money, you get married. You make money, you get married. All that sort of things. So Las Vegas is a weird culture. So he documented the wedding chapels. or they documented the wedding chapels. Notice wedding chapels and churches. Maybe some churches are wedding chapels. This is an interesting image of the main strip in Las Vegas, which you can see, that's part of it, that little curve. Can you tell me, can you guess what that is?
Light intensity.
Right, nighttime illumination, because Las Vegas is, at nighttime is all about illumination because it's open all night. So the intensity of illumination of the building establishment along the strip. Anyway, so that goes on and on. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention why I have it up here. Because, so this is a postcard from Las Vegas. This is the cover of the book, the inside cover, and Noli plan. So Las Vegas is placed against the Noli plan. So there must be a reason. Venturi is saying something. And the book ends with this. Sorry. The book ends with this. That on the left is a Roman arch. That's how you enter the city. In Las Vegas, you have these billboards. So, when I was in Hawaii, I lived in Hawaii for many years. I thought this is the end of the road. I arrived in paradise. You know, Hawaii is described as paradise. So all of this is really interesting. So I noticed in a gas station a sign, your final destination, Las Vegas. So I'm in Hawaii, that's my final destination. I've come to paradise. So, but then when you go to Las Vegas, maybe you'll find tan Hawaii. So, you know, the paradise is always over there. Okay, so I won't say too much about this at all, I won't say much. You know, but at our institute, we're interested in public spaces. This drawing was done by Rochana, who is sitting in the back. We can thank her for this. We're interested in all kinds of public spaces, from the larger formal ones to riverbanks, which is a public space. It's no longer a public space, but it used to be a public space, no longer a public space, but can be a public space. By legal definition, it is a public space. The street is a public space. We think that sidewalks are very important. We should recover the sidewalk as a public space. Okay, and just a couple of buildings because they're interesting. Public space, the nature of architectural buildings, and I mentioned that we're not interested in buildings, interested in spaces outside buildings, between buildings. But public space can actually merge within the building. This is the spiral building by Fumihiko Maki, which is conceived as celebrating the public life, the urban life. You can go in and there's a big sort of interior plaza, if you like, where a ramp takes you up to upper level galleries and all that. The building facade itself is conceived as, the city of Tokyo is not a very coherent city, urbanistically, small buildings, big buildings, fat buildings, thin buildings. So the facade is conceived as a compression of Tokyo, all kind of things happening. And then you go in, you encounter this, and then you can sit here with their chairs. So you just look to the street, just watching the city. And of course, one of my favorite buildings, where the public realm enters the building. I'm sure you have seen plans of the building, and just a marvelous idea. Only that man could do it, that crazy man. No matter what you think of his other buildings and his urban plans. But this is the Carpenter Center for the Arts in Harvard University, where in plan you can see that the sidewalk becomes a ramp, goes through the building at an upper level and comes out as a ramp, and it connects to this sidewalk on the other side. So you can actually take the regular sidewalk, or you can take the ramp, go into the building, and as you pass through the building, it's a visual arts center, big glass wall, and you can see students working. They're all artists and people like that, visual artists, and you can see them work, and which is on display. So it's like walking through a classroom, If this is a classroom, there's a huge glass wall, and you can actually see what's going on. So the sidewalk becomes a ramp, goes to the belly of the building, which is the most interiorized space, right? Private, and then becomes a ramp and goes into the sidewalk. So this sort of, you can play with merging private and public. Another fantastic example of that is by James Sterling. I have not been there this time. Yes. No, in Stuttgart, which plays an interesting game. I'm sure it was inspired by the Carpenter Center. In plan, it's like this. In plan, as many people have argued, this is like a classical, neoclassical building, rectangular format, rotunda, where you should have a dome. There's no dome. It's actually a courtyard. These are all the art galleries. But you can enter the building from here, go into the courtyard, the round courtyard, and then go out on the other side. So the public street enters the building, becomes a public courtyard, which is the geographically the center of the building, which is actually a public space, and then you go out. So this is like an inversion of what is inside and outside. That's a beautiful idea. And so we have some examples where itinerary of movement, public and private, intersects. So I end here, and I started with this. Marina is not here today. Maybe you can ask her tomorrow or the day after why I put up these two images. Maybe for Marina it's too much. Maybe for some of you it's too much. But I thought I'd like to explore the range of public spaces. And I mentioned the mosque is a public space for all kinds of reasons. The assembly hall is not a public space, but it's the most public building. So the most public building may not be a public space. It's restricted. And then of course, you know, the assembly hall is not only about the building itself, spaces around it, which historically used to be public. And then there's the South Plaza, by the name itself, it should be public, but now it's restricted. So I think we need to recover that. But I think in plan, but you know, Marina's, I think, yes, we can place these two plans together, why not? I think some architects have arrived at that position. Marina's work requires that. Marina's work, I think the mosque is very much influenced by Khan's work. The geometry, the orientation, but that's not, I'm not interested in the architectural configuration, but I'm interested in, which we can discuss day after tomorrow, how they become, and then not become, and then perhaps again become experience of public spaces. Thank you. দু একটা প্রশ্ন থাকলে আজকে নিতে পারি, নাহলে we can have it day after tomorrow. লম্বা হয়ে গেল. I'm sorry. কারো কোনো প্রশ্ন? Okay, I think I mentioned that while I was discussing it. I think that, as I said, it's used in an overlapped way, alternately. But public realm emphasizes the access of the public. It's for everyone. That's public, Janavan, and open, accessible, reachable for anyone in that city. The civic emphasizes the civic nature, meaning that there's a code of conduct of that particular city, how you can be together as a collective. The public bulle doesn't. But civic bulle already there's a kind of little stature to the space. And also there is a way of behaving in that space. Civic, আমরা বলি না যে সভ্য, তারপর আরেকটা ইংরেজিতে বলি civic, uncivil behavior. So the civic really implies being part of the collective and behaving in a certain way, which is what Richard Sennett's argument. Public realm doesn't mean that you go around crazy, and you know, because it's, you know, I am the queen of this place, not quite like that. You know, there is a ethics of behavior. So civic implies the more ethics of behavior in a collective situation. Public bulle doesn't, but I think it implies. forum of ours. ঘর থেকে আমরা বাইরে বেরোতে পারি। Okay, thank you.